Disasters. Okay, we're going to have a look at the criminology of disasters, both real and imagined. Okay, and hopefully you'll find this an interesting topic area to look at. So we've been studying criminology and specifically high-tech crime, but just to come at things from a slightly different angle, this topic is going to think about kind of crime and criminology and society and how criminal justice systems in the light of sudden disruptions to society. I'm going to look at some real examples of sudden disruptions to society and also look at some fictional examples, and we're going to do that because actually they provide a good source of kind of thought exercises for us, a good source of engaging ways for us to think about this particular topic area. So here's a real life example. This is an image following Hurricane Katrina, which is where the city of New Orleans was flooded. And there was certainly a temporary and fairly extensive, it could be argued, loss of law and order in the city following the disruption to all the infrastructure of the cities and the normal kind of social structure. This particular image here, we can see looters will be shot because looting was an issue that took place in the city. And what happened was there were some immediate questions raised about kind of who's valuable in society, who's not valuable in society. Many of the poorer residents of New Orleans couldn't afford to evacuate, they had nowhere to evacuate to, and crucially they were to some extent, at least initially, they were kind of let down by some of the emergency services, and somebody had to step in and take that place. Again, please loot, I love to shoot. So there was definitely people kind of referring to this as a society, of course, where weapons are fairly widely available. So there was an issue of looting and people having to defend their own streets, their own communities, their own property and houses. It was interesting. Go and have a look at some of this. If so a white man shot 3 black men during Hurricane Katrina pleads guilty. Okay, there was definite issues around were people genuinely defending their property, or were some people taking the opportunity to go and exercise something that they'd always wanted to do. Okay, there's quite a few cases that you can go and look up if it's an area that you're interested in. What's interesting as well, what emerges is the ambiguity against where you as a citizen might be carrying out a morally good act, but it might be an act which technically is illegal. So a good example to look at is the case of Jabbar Gibson and the stolen bus. Okay, so what happens if someone shows initiative, but it may not be kind of within the bounds of the normal legal situation. So there was a group of residents, they were trying to think of how to get out, they were completely stuck, they were completely desperate, okay, how it was going to go about. So this particular individual basically commandeered a bus, I think it was a classic American school bus, okay, and he got people onto the bus and they moved them out of the area where they'd effectively been abandoned, or they certainly perceived themselves to have been abandoned. Now, was that person a hero because he organised something and rescued these particular group of residents, or was he a vehicle thief? And this was a debate, if you click on the link that follows it through, an interesting debate that arose out of that. Okay. There's another good example of this from the Indonesia earthquake, where there was looting following that particular earthquake, and again survivors saying we need to eat. Okay, so there was a deadly earthquake, there was a tsunami, there was a disruption to the infrastructure, they were facing food shortages, there was no imminent sign of help coming from the kind of the central or regional authorities, so some people began to loot shops and petrol stations to cope. They needed fuel for their vehicles, and they needed food and they needed water. Okay, you can click on the link to go and see a kind of video clip went on. Now, in many of these instances, whether it's in New Orleans or Indonesia or somewhere, you may find that there are people who are looting for personal gain. Okay, people who are looting because they're engaged in the theft of property. But there will also be people who may be looting because they are desperate and they are looking for basic needs. It's certainly hard to defend the footage of people. Again, a quick search around will help me find it. Post Katrina and also Hurricane Irma, where there was big disruptions to civic society, where people were seen stealing trainers, boxes and boxes of branded trainers, or people were seen stealing, like, big flat screen TVs and stuff. These were not essential supplies. But then, from the authorities' point of view, how do you sort of define looting? How do you have more subtle laws or not about it? Okay, World War Z, to use the Americanism, World War Z if you will. Okay, this is a good example of the kind of thing where we get the so-called zombie apocalypse. Okay, zombie movies. Zombie movies are very popular, and one of the reasons they're very popular in cinema and TV is that it's a good excuse to have lots of people on screen being shot, because the people aren't real people, because they've now become infected, they're zombies. Okay, and it makes for great tension because the central cast of characters is normally trying to survive in the aftermath of this, and there's the ever-present threat of the zombies around as well. What you'll also see in a lot of these ones are scenes where people are having to think about, again, what do you need to survive? What are the basics that you need to survive? And again, in World War Z, there's certainly a good scene early on in a supermarket where everything's getting quite chaotic and there's a mixture of looting taking place, but also people looking for basic goods as well. Okay, people might be willing to pay, but there's no means to pay, there's no cashiers to pay, and other people are in there because they're stealing goods for for their own ends, goods that they're then going to sell on or whatever. You get a great sense of the tension from it. Again, it's not unique to it. I'm going to come on to Survivors shortly, and again, there's a very good scene in Survivors in both the kind of original 1970s version and then the version that was redone back about 2008, where we have this classic scene in a supermarket where a looter has been hung, okay, and then somebody is claiming to take over the deliverance of the rule of law. So in the absence of the normal legal authorities, where you've got this sudden vacuum, this sudden social and criminological vacuum, okay, then who is it that can take over? Who is allowed to do this? For the legal students especially who are watching this, who are doing the module, there are of course a number of acts that you can go and look up. Have a look in some of the additional supporting notes, or just go and have a look at things like the Civil Contingencies Act and various other things like that to give you a sense of the kind of legislation that can be brought through. And indeed, just last week, we had an emergency act of Parliament that was put through to restrict the freedom of movement, okay, and restrict various things that we could normally do in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic. And again, you can go and have a look at that. All the legislation, the actual act itself is online. You can go and read through the details of it. Okay, The Walking Dead. Again, The Walking Dead's a good one because we've got people at peril. It's a classic kind of zombie one. And one of the things that comes up here, it comes up to some extent with World War Z, but certainly in The Walking Dead, and certainly things like 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later, and certainly in things like Survivors and stuff, is that besides this fictional zombie peril, okay, but we'll suspend disbelief and it's a real peril for the purposes of the movie or the TV series, whatever, the other very real perils come from other human beings, other groups of survivors. And now sometimes people collaborate and then sometimes people are in conflict. So again, in terms of it being a piece of fiction, okay, it's very excitable, it's very watchable. But it should also make us think about, who's morally in the right here. And certainly when these programs are designed, we're introduced to characters, some of which we were meant to identify with as the goodies, some of which we're meant to identify with fairly straight away as the baddies, okay? But they may be doing similar things, so we like the goodies, but the goodies may be looting from the same supermarket or stealing vehicles, etc., and we think that's okay because they're doing it to help their survival. Whereas when we see the baddies doing it, it may be less so, okay? Okay, 28 weeks later, right? And again, what I've done with some of these is, because we're doing an online version, is that I can't as readily embed video clips and things in here, but what I've done is put links to trailers for quite a few of these programs and TV movies and stuff, okay, in a later slide, right? So if you're interested in these, go and have a look at some of the links to some of the trailers. You can also find some of these full length online, okay, and I've also put links into some stuff on box of broadcast, okay, or Bob. Alright, so again, 28 weeks later, again, it's interesting. We've moved on from the 28 days later scenario. Everything seems to have apparently calmed down to some extent. Martial law's cleaning operation, and then, of course, for the purpose of making it an exciting film, you know, it all has to go wrong. And we have the military who is shooting the infected, but the military will also inevitably end up shooting civilians, and deciding what's the price, what's the greater good here, okay? So if we have to bomb and destroy parts of London, okay, is that a small price to pay? Is there a net benefit to the rest of humanity, etc., etc., from the point of doing that? And again, it's a theme that will come up in things like Outbreak, which is a film from about 1985, I think. Again, I've got a link into our journey with Dustin Hoffman. There's a bit there where there's an outbreak of a virus, but the decision is, if they don't control it by a certain point, they'll actually drop a nuclear weapon on the location where it is to effectively sterilise the area, because whilst it may kill everybody within the blast radius, etc., it's for the greater good. And this is a common theme. So, you know, why do we do stuff for the greater good, and who decides at what point, you know, it's in there. Okay, so Survivors. These are a couple of stills from the 2008 version, okay? I'd call it a remake. Apparently the producers don't see it as a remake, but they see it as being inspired by the same original TV series. So Survivors, Terry Nation, first broadcast, I think it was 1975. This is the original version. We've got a group of survivors following a global pandemic. Absolutely fantastic. Look at this VHS copy, right? I was absolutely riveted by this when I watched it when it was broadcast. Created by Terry Nation, guy who basically came up with the idea of the Daleks. And there's a flask that's dropped in a laboratory, okay? And then the guy who's infected by whatever was in the flask that was being developed, you see this kind of montage at the opening of each program where he's travelling around the world and the infection spreads around the world, okay? We currently have people flying in from overseas places who are not being checked for COVID-19 as they're coming through Heathrow, etc., and that's something that people are picking up and commenting on social media. So the police may be stopping people congregating against the regulations at the moment, but people are also saying, but hang on, people are flying in, they're not being checked, they're not being swabbed, they're not having their temperatures checked, etc., etc., as they're coming through Heathrow and other airports into the UK. The more recent version, okay, Survivors, matches up to what you can see on there. Okay, again, brought it up to date neatly. Again, I've got a couple of links in towards the end to some clips that you can see to give you a sense of it. And one of the crucial bits here on the back, it says, so we've got this breakdown society, they're having to establish a new community, they're in conflict with other people, okay, and the bottom image that you can see as I look at this is actually where they've gone into a supermarket and they were getting some supplies from a supermarket, and somebody else has turned up saying, aha, we've got some looters and we're going to effectively, you know, we'll kill looters, and it's like, well, who is this person to put themselves in charge all of a sudden? And that's happened in the original series, okay, and also happened in the more recent updates. And on the back blurb of this cover it says, but with no law and no order they face terrible dangers, not just the trials of day-to-day life but also the deadly threat from other survivors. Okay, so it's a common theme that goes on here about what happens when there's a complete, you know, maybe temporary maybe enduring breakdown in society and the normal legal processes and criminal justice systems, etc. You see a number of different scenarios that come up with these, okay? So there are some in which there's lots of people are left after the disaster, especially in the fictional ones, but there's little or no technology, certainly little or no electronic technology, okay? And as a high-tech crime module, that's kind of, you know, something that we should find deeply interesting. And so in these settings, there's little technology left. Again, a good one to look up would be, there's a novel, also an audiobook called 1 Second After by William Forstchen. And there's also a TV series that you can look at called Jericho from 2006. There's a number of instances of this. I picked these two because they're both quite realistic scenarios insofar as they're both focused on the United States after an electromagnetic pulse or EMP attack. Okay, EMP is a very real thing, and the shortened version is you can detonate a nuclear warhead high up in the atmosphere, and it generates an electromagnetic pulse, and the pulse effectively fries and destroys all the electronics. And what you see in both 1 Second After and what you see in the TV series Jericho is the effect on those communities. Then, you know, how do they cope? What happens with the immediate breakdown of law and order? What do you do about people who are looting? What do you do about roving bands of people, etc., etc., etc.? Okay, and again, who's got the claim to power? You know, this is a constant theme throughout these kings. So, you know, good ones to go and have a look at if it's an area that you're interested in. In another scenario, we've got ones where there's very few people, and sometimes there's lots of technology and other material resources. Okay. So a good example of this one would be survivors. So we can go back to our survivors, whichever version of it you want. Okay. You'll also find it in a number of other scenarios as well, where for some reason there's suddenly not many people around, but there is lots of stuff that's available. Okay, it's quite a common one in quite a few of the zombie ones as well, depending on how you look at it. The Day of the Triffids is also a good example of this kind of thing. So in the Day of the Triffids, we've got a population which is largely there to start with, okay, but the population's blinded. There's a blindingly bright meteorite shower display, and the following day most of the population of the world wakes up and they can't see. Right, and this rapidly begins to run through and have all kinds of problems. You can imagine there's very high mortality rate when suddenly most people can't see. There are lots of accidents. None of the buses and stuff are running. Okay, so there's lots of stuff there, but there's no, you know, the power's out and all the police services and everything like that, they're all equally affected. And it's been made into a film and stuff a few times, so I'm just going to read you a little quote from it here, which is a really good one. So there's a bit where there's a group of survivors and they've joined up and they're having a meeting at a university. And we've got an academic who's addressing them, and he's saying that effectively they're going to have a situation where as soon as they can, the women who can start having babies need to start having babies because they'll be sighted babies under this particular scenario. Okay, and if they're going to survive as a group, they need sighted people. Okay, so to survive long run, they're going to need sighted people. And there's somebody saying, are you advocating free love? Are you saying that the people should be having sex outside of marriage? And he's basically saying, you know, he didn't advocate love for free, bargained or otherwise, but making the point that their circumstances have massively changed. Let me just find the particular quote about the sudden change of circumstances, which means that how they perceived their own moral codes and legal codes had suddenly changed. So I think this is Professor Vorler speaking, and he says, in other words, different environments set different standards. I point this out to you because the world we knew is gone, finished. The conditions which framed and taught us our standards have gone with it. Our needs are now different and our aims must be different. If you want an example, I would suggest to you that we have all spent the day indulging with perfectly easy consciences in what 2 days ago would have been housebreaking and theft. With the old pattern broken, we have now to find out what mode of life is best suited to the new. We have not simply to start building again, we have to start thinking again, which is much more difficult and far more distasteful. So it makes the point that what they've been doing is they've been gathering supplies, so they've been surviving themselves, they've also been sent to gather supplies. So it makes the point that, you know, they were engaged in housebreaking, engaged in property theft, okay, but doing it with perfect clear conscience, which to this kind of largely middle class bunch of survivors would have been a complete anathema until a few days ago. But the circumstances have suddenly changed. And the circumstances suddenly changed for the people in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. They've changed for other people after Hurricane Irma, and they've changed suddenly in other parts of the world following various natural disasters, whether it was tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. Okay, so it's an interesting question where it takes us back to basics, thinking about how we put all this stuff together. There's another one where there's very few people and very little technology or other resources. Okay, so these kind of end of the world scenarios. There's often where there's been aliens, or there's been a Holocaust, or rampaging zombies, etc., etc. So we could map these out and think about them, because again, it puts us in a slightly different starting position. So our set of circumstances, which have suddenly changed, or change into a new set of circumstances, which might help to some extent to dictate our future behaviours, etc. Okay. So, in summary, we're thinking about what happens when normal social relations are disruptive. Through examining disasters, both real and imagined, it may give us insights. Okay. Academics, I've put some links in the notes on now to an empirical analysis of crime rates before, during, and after crisis. So we can look at that. This is not just idle speculation. We can get some sense about how it affects, for example, crime patterns and stuff. And we're thinking about the state of a community, okay, and often there has to be this kind of understanding, this community acceptance of being policed. So again, if you think in terms of to protect and serve, which is the motto of one of the US city police state forces, okay, to protect and serve, it's all about serving the community, and it raises those fundamental questions about, are the police part of the community which they serve, or are the police separate to the community? But also, if suddenly there's a complete absence of the police, or the police are not there in sufficient numbers, okay, and controls are taken away, right, then what can happen to behaviour? Same with changes and challenges in crime and criminal justice. Okay, here we've got some sample references. Okay, so again, if it's an area that interests you, go and have a look at some of these. It'll give you some good academic support and things. I've also made some suggestions from a box of broadcasts. So again, I'll put a link in from now. You'll need your NTU login, but it'll take you through to any of these. You click on the link, it'll let you in and go to them. Okay. So Contagion in this particular one is actually a panorama documentary rather than the movie. Outbreak is a documentary about Ebola, okay, so a real life thing. I've also put a link in to Outbreak the movie, right, and because these are on box of broadcast, you can go and watch the full programs rather than watching just trailers or little clips. I've also put some links in, as I said, to some of the trailers and things mentioned in here. So World War Z, our official trailer, Contagion and Outbreak, and links into some useful sequences and stuff. So they raise those kind of questions. Yeah, and again, there's a great quote from Survivors, the primer bit that I put in for you, where one of the characters says, you know, we make our own law now. So it's that thing about just getting you to think as a little thought exercise. It's just a bit different to the rest of the module about how we would do stuff. I've also put a link in to, and again, I'd normally talk about this in the seminar and stuff, a graphic novel. You can see an image of it, the front of it here, about zombie preparedness. Right, and this is an official US Department of Health and Human Services publication. And you might think, well, why would they, an official department, produce a guide to dealing with zombie pandemics? Because zombies are real. Okay, Well, the reason they've done it is they know that people are really interested in zombies, and they're really interested in kind of zombie apocalypse movies and TV series, etc. So what you can do is present really valuable information in the guise of a novel that's about a zombie pandemic. Because all the advice and suggestions, and this includes an emergency preparedness checklist that you can go to, and again I've linked into this particular graphic novel, it's on now, click on the link and you can see the whole graphic novel, and it'll link there's an emergency preparedness checklist of the kind of things that you need in an emergency. So what it's doing, of course, is it's using the zombie pandemic as a kind of metaphor, as a way of getting people to think about, okay, the zombie pandemic may not be a real problem, but a pandemic may be a real problem. Okay, we've got one at the moment. Or, certainly at the time this was produced, they were thinking in terms of a widespread, for example, a terrorist attack. So some kind of terrorist attack that may cause massive civil disruption. So what kind of things would you want people to do in those circumstances to have some level of preparedness? And if a lot of households have got certain basic things in, okay, so whether it's like a week's supply of food, or a first aid kit, or a radio, and candles, and torches, and this kind of stuff, right, it can make a real big difference to how well you can go. But it also links back into thinking about your community networks. So again, there are people in the States, not exclusively the States, but in the States, you know, the survivalists. And one of the big things that comes about survivalists, and these are people who are kind of prepping for the end of the world as we know it, right? And because they're in the States, they can hoard weapons and ammunition. They'll also hoard supplies of food and water and batteries and radio and gasoline and all this kind of stuff. But if you have a look at some of the advice on some of those networks and sites, one of the things that comes out is that you can do so much on your own, but actually it works really well in a network. It works really well in a community. So one of the things we need to think about is how we can continue communities and networks in a time of stress, you know, real civil stress on civil society. And again, as I'm recording this at the moment, you know, we're in lockdown. We can go out, but under limited circumstances. Otherwise, we have to explain ourselves, and we could potentially be arrested. You're presumably watching this online somehow, and you'll be doing lots of stuff online. So people are doing exercise online. People are having drinking parties online. People are having all kinds of things where they're meeting up online, or they're making phone calls to people, or they're messaging people and stuff like that, so that you're not isolated in a time of kind of potentially great stress. Okay, so this was a session that I normally do towards the end of the module, towards the end of the second term of the module. It's ended up in there as well, and I would normally, if you're thinking this is a bit short, of course, normally when we're in the classroom sessions, I would play you some of the trailers, right, and then we'd have some more discussions around it and have questions about it and have some exercises. It's not practical to do all that in this session, but hopefully it's got you thinking about you know, what you would do in an emergency, what happens to the forces of law and order in an emergency, and who certainly, you know, who has the rights, okay, you know, who wields the power, and whether you're looking at survivors or Day of the Triffids, or here I've got The Death of Grass, which is another disaster novel by somebody called John Christopher. In this one, basically all the kind of the grasses, which includes like all the corn and all the wheats and everything in the world, die out, and so suddenly everyone's kind of hungry. What happens there? I haven't really touched upon, but again, a popular theme a few decades ago would have been, for example, nuclear catastrophes. So if you think of a movie like Threads, or you can go and look other ones up. So a lot of people were really concerned about and worried about, okay, what happened if we lurched into an uncontrolled nuclear war, and wouldn't it be terrible? And again, lots of movies, films, TV series and books which looked at that kind of thing. Since that time, we've tended to move on to more things like kind of bio threats, biohazards, and we're living through a biohazard thing at the moment, or we perhaps have a kind of an undefined existential external threat of some kind. Okay, so it might be aliens, or it might be there's some kind of undefined disaster, we're not quite sure what. So if you think about something like a novel and a film like The Road, for example, okay, it's not clear what exactly has gone wrong with society. All we need to know is something's gone wrong with society, and then we see the consequences played out. Okay, but in terms of certainly in visually appealing things, okay, then zombies are very visually appealing. It means you can shoot lots of on-screen characters, you can blow lots of things up, you have lots of moments of power, lots of excitement. So if it's an area that you're interested in, then go watch some of those, but then think about some of the underlying kind of messages and structures and things that are being examined as part of the film and as part of the series, etc., etc. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Sorry I'm not at my most clear vocally, but hopefully this has been clear enough, and it's just given you a few little things to think about. Fantastic. Do the quiz based on some of the things that I've spoken about. Go and have a look at the Zombie Pandemic Preparedness novel. Click on some of the links, follow up some of the sources, or go and read some of the background stuff, which you may find of interest, some of the background academic papers about this kind of stuff. Thank you very much.